Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Australian Airports Association webinar series. Today's webinar is brought to you by Ailevon Pacific Aviation Consulting. My name is Matthew Findlay and one of the directors at the consulting firm. And today we'll take you through what we see as the impact to air service and its recovery in an Australian context, but also more broadly. Just a little bit about us to start with, so you can have a flavour for who we are and what we do. We're about 10 years old and headquartered in Atlanta and Sydney. We are members of the AAA and also the New Zealand Airports Association, as well as ACI. There's about 12 consultants and staff, and we cover about 8 different locations in 3 different countries. And we're very pleased to help our clients and those that call upon us for our different services that we provide. Today, what we'll cover in today's presentation, in broad speaking terms, 4 areas really. What has been the impact globally, regionally, and then of course more locally? Where have losses been most severe, and how have different nations responded? We'll also then take a look at the consequences of the challenges that Virgin faces today, and also a single airline aviation market. What could a new emerged VA look like? Which markets will return to the skies first? And then how do we ambitiously secure airline capacity or flights that are lost? So, of course, COVID-19 is a significant story for all of us, and we've been all impacted in different ways. Certainly the top 10 locations around the world where infections are occurring is no secret to many of you. The USA, of course, outstripping a lot of other economies. And of course, we've begun to see a number of reported cases surging overnight, in fact, in Russia, which will leap from probably being the number 4th market to number 2 and remain there for a period of time. China, meanwhile, has probably seen the worst pass. And so we're pleased to see that in some respects, a lot of the capacity, airline capacity in China is slowly returning. India continues to grow and probably will be in the top 10 within the next week or so. Certainly the US combined outstrips Western Europe, and regionally grouping it, all those nations in Western Europe are lucky to see that they're seeing a number of caseloads reduce over time, which is pleasing. But what is disappointing in that region, of course, has been the UK, which is beginning to catch up to some of the milestones that Spain and Italy previously have faced. And certainly trying to face the challenges of COVID has been trying for many different nations. Regionally for Australia, South Korea, and a number of other nations within the Asia Pacific, the measures that have been taken have been largely successful in suppressing cases, which has given confidence to economies. But globally, the caseloads continue to only plateau, and we've certainly seen a significant amount of economic and social consequences as a result of this pandemic. What's really evident to us now is that more than ever before have passenger volumes proven to be the most crucial element and the single largest value driver for airports principally. Even property assets or commercial developments that have been undertaken on airports, even they continue to be significantly challenged in these times. So regardless of your scale or scope, there's probably little difference for some of you in regards to, or most of you in regards to the fact that our impact from this crisis has been far-reaching, and never before have we all been in this together, insofar as passenger volume certainly being a key driver of the value of our business, but also the reasons why we exist. Aviation and visitor economies have been significantly impacted by this crisis. Something in the order of 5 to 7 years to recover, and an impact of somewhere between $300 and $450 billion worth of impact. International tourist flows in particular will be down as we look to recover over the longer term. So turning to capacity cuts more regionally and locally in our markets, domestic seat changes in Australia are profound. The most significant previous event or period of time where we saw declines in some ways close to this was back around about 9/11, of course, Ansat's collapse and then the Bali bombings. There was a reduction of about 22% in seats, or just under 1 million seats. Now with COVID-19, currently we're looking at about 91% fall in seats, or about close to 6 million in actual volume terms. So this is unprecedented, really, in many ways. And many of you will also have or see in your businesses, or if you're a supplier to various airports, some airports will have zero traffic right now, or very few compared to what they would normally have. May 29 volumes are down 91.5%. And in respect to international markets, seat changes have also been equally as significant. Previously, 9/11 or about that period in time, when we also had SARS overseas and other markets, the decline was about 5%. Now, more recently, the seat changes have been close to 5 million in seats internationally, or 95% of flow and volumes previously. So airlines have adjusted their schedules and their capacity to reflect the cessation of demand, effectively people not wanting to fly at the moment. And of course, even on the day of operations, they're changing their daily flight schedules to suit demand as needed. Australia's last steepest decline occurred about 2001 through to 2004, but the drop in demand was over a 13-month period. Now, of course, all of you will be aware that COVID has hit us pretty hard and quickly, whereas the previous time that Australia saw such a significant drop was about the early part of the 2000s. And what happened is that over a 31-month period, passengers, it took about that period of time to come back insofar as demand. Seats took a bit longer, about 36 months, but the drop, as I mentioned, was about 30 months from top to bottom. And only about 6 months out from that did airlines begin to see some sort of interest in flying again, as demand and the economy began to recover. And so in your thinking in regards to your own business, and indeed if you're a supplier to airports or airlines for that matter, you'll need to start thinking about when schedules come back into the system, when they will need to start thinking about planning for capacity being redeployed into each of your markets. Now, if we just look at one particular example where early on in the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, many people referred to the challenges that Hong Kong in particular had with SARS back in, again, 2002, 2003. That emerged very quickly in Hong Kong and had a massive impact on their economy, and of course on the schedules that Cathay Pacific and others had at that time in Hong Kong. Now, you can see there the significant drop of about 60 points. And so what we've also now seen, of course, is that COVID has matched that decline in its velocity, but also we're just at the bottom now of about 3 to 5% in either domestic or international markets. Now, the challenge will be how quickly that demand comes back. Now, SARS previously, you can see an upward tick very quickly within a year or so. And so what we're hoping to see is a similar sort of recovery, but I think that's not likely to be the case at this point in time, but time will tell. Remember, a lot of things need to happen for a recovery of that sort of nature. And every country has had severe loss of air capacity. Southeast Asian countries have had, with less international flights, have had not as much impact, and certainly the April schedules that we've just had seen in the different booking systems have shown that only a few countries have escaped severe drops in their capacity. And that's not different for other carriers that are working in the Asia Pacific or North America or the European markets, where there's significant cuts in capacity over a short period of time. And another interesting clue as to what is happening in the different airline markets will be Singapore Airlines announcement of the Q1 earnings result tomorrow at about 11 o'clock our time. Looking to a similar market not too far from Singapore, China's domestic recovery is a very slow progress. You can sort of see there in the middle of February the lowest number of flown flights, but then a very quick rebound, but then a steady increase over many weeks and months. And of course, something is being seen that's similar in the US market now. Of course, there's been stimulation of that market and not the same reduction that we've seen domestically in the US. But internationally, China continues to be a very small part of or portion of what they used to fly previously. Very small volumes of flown flights, and a large number that continue to be not flown or cancelled at the last minute. It's important to remember how many international tourists took internal flights in Australia. Now, so China is our largest international market insofar as international visitors, but also a very significant the largest trading partner. And so approximately 99% of previous outbound volumes are missing from the market today. Just turning quickly to the US, more recently there's been a turn in sentiment. Bookings do look encouraging insofar as recent relaxation of restrictions in different states. And of course, there aren't hard borders within the continental USA. So as restrictions and easing has been allowed, bookings do look like they return relatively quickly insofar as the current booking systems that are recording those today are indicating that we do see some light at the end of the tunnel. But with declining capacity regionally, there's a number of carriers that continue to schedule returns to the flying that they used to have. Just this week, though, Qantas, of course, extended their operational hibernation. They said that they would not reinstate their schedules in June as they had hoped, but in fact, late June and into July, they would return their schedules to normal. Now, what we're also seeing is that overnight, Ryanair, for instance, noted that they would return 90% of their capacity from early June. And of course, some other interesting challenges with all of this is that, and we've had this illustrated to us on a number of occasions, is that taking capacity out of the system is actually very difficult to achieve because there's many different ways in which schedules are put into different databases for booking flights and that sort of thing. And so, of course, there will be a small lag of time before we can get other sort of indications of what other carriers are putting into their schedules and booking systems. But certainly, what is interesting is that Cathay Pacific more recently have informed us that they're returning their network team back to the office full time to look at ways in which they can begin to recover their schedules. So turning to our sort of more topical discussion around our current challenges with our second carrier, Virgin. Qantas is still, of course, the dominant carrier in the Australia, New Zealand and Pacific market. And of course, you can see here that VA Group had about 37% market share of those particular geographies. And a much smaller presence than both QF and JQ combined. But certainly, if they were to leave our skies, they would leave a significant hole in the Australasian network that they served, with about 55 ports, 40 of them being domestically, and most of them, of course, being concentrated in the domestic market with about 92%. But they do span a significant network within Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. But also have other services to Bali, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Japan, and of course USA. Of course, they exited the Hong Kong route before COVID-19, but unfortunately never had the chance to start Haneda. Most of their seats were concentrated in what's known as the Golden Triangle. This is a significant corporate market with about 30% of all seats. But within the top 20 sectors they flew, only 5 touched regional ports. And by and large, those 5 ports that they did touch were more or less based in Queensland, where most of their regional flying is concentrated. Almost all their routes, in some respects, that are significant in volume to them, are based within the Queensland hub. Now, that's not too surprising in some respects, Brisbane being their corporate headquarters. But maybe Rex is coming to the rescue. Some of you would have seen the news overnight also, or late yesterday, that Rex had proposed that they could possibly serve the Golden Triangle and some other key capital cities, and also suggested that they would have some jets available to operate those services. Now, I think it's important, if Rex is a customer of yours in some form or fashion, certainly being in touch with them is something that you should do sooner rather than later. If you're not sure who to contact, then by all means, at the end of this webinar, be in touch, and we can try and facilitate that for you. And overnight, Interglobe, the owner of Indigo Airlines from India, was touted as perhaps being an interested party in acquiring Virgin. The interesting thing about Australians and where we want to go to is that a lot of our travel is, of course, concentrated within Australia. And so when you start to think about how does travel within Australia restart, certainly locally and regionally, and then interstate travel becomes more and more important, particularly if our international borders are closed. And when you think about our international borders being closed, here's a snapshot of where each of us have travelled to over the last 12 months in 2019. A vast number, of course, going to New Zealand, but then equally, in many cases, a larger number, sometimes tenfold, if not more, travelling to other places around the world. Now, whether in fact we're able to do that in the not too distant future or not is a question to be determined, but certainly there are a number of parties that are very keen to see international travel start again. So perhaps across the Tasman might be an opportunity initially. And here's a snapshot of in 2019 where different New Zealanders travelled to, by and large, over that last year. A large majority, of course, going to Australia, and New Zealand travellers make up the second largest visitor market. And so this is why the Trans-Tasman bubble becomes a more significant or of more significant interest for our airline partners, but also for the travelling public. Combine those two markets together insofar as where Aussies and Kiwis used to go within Australia and New Zealand respectively, but also where each nation used to travel internationally no longer being available, suddenly could open up a number of new ports both sides of the Tasman. Now, these are indicative ranges and dependent on, of course, flow and capabilities, and also climatic conditions and what have you. But in essence, there are new opportunities that could be created with this market that no longer could be served by flying further afield. But what comes first? What's the segment that really kicks it off? Is it the regional and domestic and then international, intercontinental? But who travels on board these flights? Leisure travellers first, or is it visiting family and relatives? Is it business, or is it government? Is it the students that couldn't get to their university or higher education providers before? And on what basis do they return? Now, there's all these considerations to take into account, and each of you, your own destination, will have something to think about in regards to which you think is more likely to return first. Now, a lot of airlines will be very interested in hearing that from you, simply because you'll have an informed view that a lot of airline people, unfortunately, in their head offices where they make network decisions, won't necessarily know. So it's important to think about that. In addition, of course, there's also the existing cargo demand. Now, we've seen a large number of fleets nationally and also internationally grounded, which has impacted supply chains. 80% of the world's air freight is travelled flown in the belly hold of passenger aircraft. Now, as those fleets have been grounded, there's been mechanisms put in place, such as the IFAM, International Freight Assistance Mechanism in Australia, to unblock and encourage flights to allow supply chains to reopen. In our part of the world, there's many things to consider insofar as encouraging travel and also getting people back on planes, but also back through our airports and allowing people to reconnect with one another. There's different ways in which nations and destinations are trying to overcome the challenges of safely enabling people to travel. Does a trusted health passport become adopted insofar as enabling people to travel? Are there regional bubbles that can become created, like Singapore or Brunei, for instance? Or if there is a Tasman bubble that's formed, do we invite other nations to join in due course? The airlines need to think of themselves as well as providing safety insofar as the flight itself, but also safety insofar as health and ensuring that they are perceived as providing the best environment in which, or safest environment in which they can travel. And will mandated social distancing be required? Certainly, IATA and other sort of bodies have dismissed the idea, but certainly there are a lot of concerned travellers. Sports and other events typically in front of crowds, driving the demand for travel. In what ways are business leaders addressing the fears of health and safety for their own staff to enable leaders to then choose or allow their staff to travel more regularly? And how do airlines react to this? And quite often they need information from each of you as your own airport operator or destination to provide them information about what it is that you're seeing on the ground there so they can make informed decisions. Restoring confidence in air travel becomes critical. Domestic is likely to come first, then regionally, then of course state and territories, and then wider border openings. But in the USA, for instance, there's been no restrictions between different states and territories. And so you begin to see where large numbers of travellers begin to emerge again. Trusted travellers, insofar as trust countries, also become more important. Onboard mitigation or pre-screening of travellers might be something that we might need to address in due course in regards to how we actually give confidence to people having the option to travel again. Book and lead periods and trusted travel brands need to be able to assure people that the travel they're planning will actually be able to be undertaken. And then personal confidence becomes an aspect to it. Many of you will be familiar, of course, that volumes of travellers are often predicated on the confidence of each individual's own circumstances insofar as being able to afford the travel, but also having confidence in their prospects for employment and that sort of thing, for confidence about their incomes. And in a new era of travel, networks will be consolidated as they look to, first of all, ensure that they cover the cash costs of flying. Airlines will be very conscious of the fact that they might not initially be able to get strong returns and profitability from every sector they fly, but certainly they want to ensure that their cash costs are covered. And so you might see initially cheap fares to stimulate demand. Airline fleets will be restructured. Older aircraft will be parked, and many people will be familiar, of course, with Alice Springs being used to park a number of A380s and the like, as larger volume aircraft are put aside so that they can provide flying capacity needed by, or demand, I should say, for smaller gauge capacity aircraft. And certainly locally, there's examples of airports that are implementing methods to give confidence to travellers, such as Ailevon Airport with the touchless check-in facility, Canberra Airport with nurses and those sort of services provided to give confidence to passengers that their safety and well-being is being considered. Overseas in Vienna, for instance, there's a mechanism put in place whereby people can self-isolate for one evening in a hotel, wait for a COVID test that costs them €190, and then prove that they no longer need to endure the 14-day quarantine period. These are all mechanisms and means by which people are trying to give confidence back to travel. But certainly the holiday here this year, born out of the bushfire crisis, will probably play out to be a very significant strategy that's rolled out by Tourism Australia and other partners throughout Australia in the coming 12 to 18 months, if not longer. Certainly, holidaying at home might give confidence to some people who would otherwise not want to risk an international travel journey. But planning for recovery starts now. And so in 3 phases, we've more or less summarized where people should be thinking about their recovery over the short to medium term. And certainly thinking about, is your airport or destination ready for that recovery? Are you leading it? Are you taking a proactive stance and trying to ensure that you can build back that capacity as soon as it possibly could be built back? And do you have the right tools and incentives in place? And are you planning as a region to collectively reopen? There's other aspects you also might like to think about. How often have you spoken to your airline partners in your head office? Certainly locally talking to them, of course, is crucial, but also making contact with those, be it with Rex or Alliance Airlines or Air North or Qantas, Virgin, Tiger. You should be in touch with each one of those airlines, both at a local and a national level, insofar as giving them information around what you see in the local market and what they should be considering insofar as reinstating capacity back into your market. Certainly, in partnership with your stakeholders, would be a very powerful way to ensure that you're putting your best foot forward in regaining that lost capacity. And there's a raft of resources that you can turn to at this time. There's a lot of information online, and of course, the purpose of these webinars is to share information and also give you confidence that there are people out there that can help you at this time. As I mentioned, the least you could do at this point in time is be in touch with your airline partners. If you're not sure who they are, then certainly be in touch. And I'm happy to provide this presentation at the end of this webinar. At this point, I ask you for any questions. There's been a lot of content in this presentation, and I'm more than happy to take any question from any one of you in regards to some aspect or any aspect of it. But the crucial thing really is in your region, being in touch with both those at the local region, at the local level, but also in their head offices, be it in Brisbane or Sydney or Melbourne or wherever. But it's really important that you think about ways in which you can engage with those partners. Now, I do see a question there, so I'll just quickly come to that. Sorry, I'm just trying to find that question, folks. Okay, so the question, folks, is do you see the flights from 2 international hubs as presenting more of a concern for biosecurity, encouraging more P2P travel? Look, point-to-point travel, that is, folks, by the way, P2P. Yeah, look, there's been 2 schools of thought on this, really. One of the aspect of this is that large carriers like Singapore Airlines, for instance, like Delta, like a lot of hub carriers, they rely on the hub more or less, and there could be opportunities for point-to-point traffic. Certainly, in respect to the Tasman bubble, you could see, for instance, because those large volumes of residents in different markets, be it in Australia or New Zealand, who used to have the joy of being able to travel internationally, no longer able to, but might, for instance, consider, well, I haven't been to the Sunshine Coast in 5 years, or I haven't been to Adelaide in 10, time to go back. Because those large volumes exist, point-to-point travel could be stimulated. And so I guess the question really comes down to, if you are a hub carrier, how motivated are you likely to be insofar as serving a market like, those international long-haul destinations sooner rather than later? And I think the answer to that is most definitely. Are you a carrier more regionally able to serve point-to-point markets because you have a concentration of services in those key cities, well, that's also likely. So I think, it depends really on where you are. But insofar as the Australia New Zealand context is concerned, then I do see there could be, if you are encouraging enough, able to drive different outcomes that might not otherwise been there before, simply because there's an unserved pent-up demand that could be there. It's a good question, actually, because there's many different elements that are involved in this aspect, and so you could foresee, for instance, that some airlines will take a very proactive stance to encourage and give certainty to travellers that that they will see larger volumes respond to those measures they put in place, and therefore will return to greater volumes sooner rather than later. The other interesting element of all of this is that, and one of the slides touched on this, we do see as soon as significant restrictions are lifted, and more recently in New Zealand, in fact, you could turn to that as an example when they went back down through their levels, a return of demand domestically. So I think there is some encouraging glimmers out there of demand returning in some markets. Here's another question. How do you see potential monopoly markets by Qantas Group in the near future? How would that impact on price and propensity to travel? Yeah, good question. Look, I think maintaining a competitive market is absolutely crucial for prices and also choice. International travel to and from the US, of course, when Emirates began, really lifted the product and service standards of the existing US carriers. Because they had to compete with a competitor that, rightly or wrongly, they thought was funded by the government. Now, of course, what also has happened is that they've stepped up their service levels as a result. The newest carriers now have a far better product and offering than what they would have otherwise had if they hadn't had as much international competition. And I think that's true for Australia. Virgin has taken competition to a new level insofar as trying to compete for the corporate market that Qantas has a stranglehold on, and they've tried their best to secure those customers in that market. But I think if we were to see a monopoly arise on flights within Australia in particular, then I think it would be inevitable that the prices would rise and the propensity to travel would fall. And in some respects might encourage greater international travel, because that might be seen as more affordable simply because there is competition in that segment. Many people could, for instance, accept that flying to Bali's never been cheaper before COVID-19, with the vast array of competitors on that market segment from a number of different cities in Australia to Bali. And that's simply because there's choice available in that market segment. One of the other elements I touched on ever so briefly was in regards to air freight. And I think it's important to recognise that the IFAM initiative that's been set up by the Australian government, and there's a similar one in other countries actually around the world, that has encouraged freight forwarders and different wholesalers in that market segment, but also airlines, to collectively come together and find ways in which to open up trade links, which I think is a crucial element of ensuring that product is getting to different markets, or certainly supplies coming into Australia. So it's very encouraging to see that the belly-hold freight, which did carry about 80% of the world's air freight, is being supplemented by this new freighter capacity that's available to us. Another question just coming into the chat here, and by all means, I do welcome the questions. There's some good ones here. Any thoughts on the likely recovery of business travel, given that businesses have transitioned to working from home and online communication meetings? I think this has been a risk for a long time, and I think before Zoom became popular, there are other means by which you could have these conversations, right, for business purposes. I think back to the late '80s when mobile phones first came on the scene, right? There are good reasons to use these forms of communications, but they're certainly not going to replace the nuances of meeting people face to face, and certainly in Asian countries in particular, the way in which they like to do business face to face, that's not going to go away anytime soon. So I think it'll become another tool to supplement what is already in our toolkit. And so I think it'll be part of the overall mix of communication means that we use to enable business travel. The interesting thing about business travel, though, is when you talk about leisure and taking a holiday and seeing friends and family, the decision makers of those trips, which generally might exist between one person or a couple or a family of 4 or 5, however it might be, the people making those decisions on travel is one or two people, mum or dad or whoever it might be. When you're talking about business travel, often it requires sometimes approval. And if you're in a large corporate, it might be the travel managers that determine whether, in fact, the health and safety of staff are being addressed. And so they might make the decision for thousands of people insofar as their choice or permission to travel again. So it really does come down to different sort of business choices, but also the comfort of those travellers and being able to travel again. Certainly, as a vested player in the aviation industry, I'd like to see people travelling again. And I know for a fact that even though Zoom's helpful and other tools like that, nothing beats meeting someone in person and ensuring that you're meeting their needs insofar as the customer expectation. There's hopefully a couple more questions coming through. We certainly have some more time if people want to um, put a few more questions down to me. There's sometimes a short delay in getting those questions through on the chat. I know people sometimes furiously type away. Here's a question. Right. The recommendations from the Productivity Commission's inquiry are still fresh in our minds. How do you see the current crisis impacting on the PC recommendations and responses? Good question. Which part of it are you referring to? Are you referring to the service provisions at airports, or are you referring to elements of pricing or service standards? I think you'd have to be a bit more specific, Nick. But look, I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that airports and their providers have a job to do insofar as serving the needs of airlines, and the airlines today and their customers, obviously the travelling public. The airlines today are, not necessarily in great shape. They've had a huge hit to their balance sheets and cash reserves. And, we all know the issues around Virgin Australia, of course. So being mindful of their needs in particular will be well regarded by the airlines, and indeed by customers expecting good service standards still going forward. Another question just coming into the chat here. With existing market conditions, how could regional airports and communities secure sustainable regional flying? Yeah, good question. I think the important element here is that as a destination, people will fly to your destination because of family or community or social, or economic or visitation purposes. Working with your stakeholders, the three parts of the trinity, of course, of the airport, the destination, and the airline. Now, many stakeholders come into each one of those parts of the trinity. how will it go if only one of those three parties understand the challenges of restarting regional connectivity? It's crucial that your stakeholders all go collectively as one, and meeting with and talking with uh, airlines at a headquarter level, insofar as putting forward the case for capacity to be added back into your market. I think it's really crucial that you go as a team and hunt as a pack, is a phrase that's been used in the past. And certainly that sort of philosophy should be adopted insofar as talking to airlines about why or how you see it that capacity should return to your market sooner than other competitors perhaps might like to see it. Another question here, old versus new seat capacities. You mentioned retiring of aged aircraft. Do you think the new aircraft with more seats could reduce air traffic movements in a long-term trend? Could this reduce the peak ATMs and therefore the need for new runways? Yeah, very good question. Uh, Look, I'll answer the last part of it first, in the sense that, will fewer runways be needed? My answer to that is no, simply because typically they're long life assets, and they generally, sit in the ground for very extended periods of time. And assets such as that should be delivered as when needed and useful. And certainly up until 6 months ago, the new Brisbane Airport runway, for instance, and the one reorientated in Sunshine Coast were great examples of assets that needed to be available for the connectivity of not only those regions but also to further afield. And of course, it enables competition between airlines to ensure that the markets are most effectively served and most efficiently. And so airlines respond to demand, and they will serve markets where there's pockets of demand, which is why the trinity and the group of stakeholders presenting to airlines becomes important, right? Because airlines will put capacity into markets where there's obvious pockets of demand. And so with new capacity, such as runways, allows greater frequency, which often is the reason why a lot of airlines serve markets today. They want to serve a market with depth. And what I mean by that is you serve a city pair once daily, then twice daily, then 3 times daily. But there does become a saturation point where you begin to overserve the market in some places. And that's where you have a breadth of service to different markets come into play. And to give you an example there, Jetstar flies to both Melbourne, of course, where they're based, but also Avalon. And that's simply because they've got depth in some of the markets they serve from both ports. And by serving Avalon and Melbourne itself, you end up with a breadth in the greater Melbourne, Victoria market there. So I do see long term those needs for the runway existing. They might, however, be pushed out slightly. But in any case, having that capacity available does allow competition and choice. And in key markets such as Sydney, where Western Sydney Airport is being built, consumers will appreciate the choice of being able to fly to either airport in due course. Are there any more questions at this point in time? We've got a few more minutes yet. Very happy to take any question on any particular topic relating to the presentation or other interest there. All right, folks. Well, just as we wind up there, I really do appreciate all of you being on the call today. More than happy to take or receive emails from you. But again, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you found that helpful. Have a great day.